welcome to Supernatural by Design. I hope everyone's had a blessed week. If you're new here, then welcome. And if you're returning, then welcome back. And thank you for supporting this channel. Today's topic is part 2 in a series dealing with the spiritual aspect of numbers and entitled God's Judgment and the number 11. So let's begin. Are numbers one of the ways that God communicates with us? And if so, then what do they mean? In the last video, we explored how the number 11 can mean God's promises. However, in this video, we will discover the negative aspect of the number 11, which is God's judgment, and from a biblical perspective, demonstrate through Bible verses and real events a unique number pattern found that connects the number 11 to God's judgment. Because if you remember from the first video, we discovered that God's first promise in the Bible was broken into 2 phases. First, the seed of the woman, and secondly, the crushing of the head of the serpent. However, what could be further added would be to say is this, that the seed of the woman is a promise revolving around a blessing, whereas the crushing of the head of the serpent is a promise about judgment. And therefore, because they both are founded on a promise, we will see that they share the same characteristics, connecting crucial events that land on particular dates in history and centered around the number 11, either leading up to or the fulfillment of that particular promise. And unlike a promise of blessing like we saw in part 1, in this video we will investigate 2 things. First will be how the number 11 is connected to the word judgment, and secondly, how the number 11 is uniquely tied to God's judgment in particular events in history. And lastly, we will investigate God's judgment against the seed of the serpent and show how dates in recent times match the pattern found within the Bible and will be a foreshadow of characteristics in the end times and dealing with the number 11. Because right now, prophecy is being fulfilled, and we want to highlight those connections. However, in order to investigate these prophecies about the end times, we first need to explore the number 11 and how it relates to God's judgment through words. So let's begin. Well, let's begin by examining the Bible, by highlighting Bible verse numbers that contain the word judgment in yellow that add to 11, and chapters plus verses that also add to 11 in blue. However, it is important to know that as I was preparing this video, God led me down some interesting understandings about His judgment. And so ultimately, it's our sin as a nation, person, or a being like a spiritual entity that results in a curse being placed on that sin, which is then executed on a day of judgment or a period of time of judgment. So with that said, let's jump into generating our list of verses and chapters that add to 11 and finding the word curse. And our first example is right after the first promise, which is Genesis 3:17. And is a great example to start with because the verse plus the chapter adds to 11 and demonstrates the progression leading up to God's judgment, starting with sin, followed by a curse, and finally God's judgment. And that the ground is cursed because Adam ate the fruit after being commanded not to, which was a sin, and therefore the judgment would be hard work until death. However, in our next example, Genesis 4 and verse 11, a yellow example, just being the verse number equaling 11, is where we find the word curse after Cain kills Abel. Or how about in Genesis 8:21? Because it's here that God promises not to curse the ground again by wiping out every living thing. And notice it ties the word promise and curse. Another example is in Genesis 27:29. Where Abraham is given the famous promise of anyone that blesses you will be blessed, and anyone that curses you will be cursed. And this verse is excellent in that it's another example in showing how the number 11 is tied to promise, and that it can either be a blessing or a curse. And so it's amazing to see how many examples there are, and how they demonstrate a connection to promise. But for this video, we are focusing on the word curse because it's connected to God's judgment. Because as you can see by our list, the number 11 plays a major role in the use of the word curse, which is a precursor to God's righteous judgment and to crush sin or the serpent. However, in order to see this end-time connections, let's examine some unique events that relate the number 11 to God's judgment. So let's go back in time. So let's list out some key events that tie the number 11 to God's judgment. So we will begin with Noah's flood, as we saw from the first video, because on one hand it represents God's promise of the seed of the woman and the preservation of that promise. And yet on the other hand, it represents God's judgment, as seen by the flood event itself. And so for our second example, the Tower of Babel, because God's judgment is found within the chapter number, being 11, and also serves as another example in God's judgment. In fact, another example is just a book later in Exodus chapter 11, and is linked to the final 10th plague against the entire nation of Egypt. However, another example connected to Exodus 11 can be found at the crossing of the Red Sea, because God strikes Pharaoh with a final 11th judgment and destroys Pharaoh and his entire army. Our third example can be found in the judgment against Sodom and Gomorrah, because when we compare side by side Genesis chapter 19 and verse 11 and Luke 17 verse 11, we see that the word destroyed is referenced in both passages regarding the judgment of Sodom and Gomorrah by fire and brimstone, and both are verse 11. Now let's look at some historical events related to God's judgment and the nation of Israel. In fact, two unique instances, the destruction of the first temple and the destruction of the second temple, because both were destroyed on dates that add to 11. And so for the first temple, it was destroyed by King Nebuchadnezzar, and he attacks on 10/10, which is 11. And subsequently, this will lead to the destruction of the first temple. And what is also interesting is that the ruling king of that time, King Zedekiah, was in his 11th year of reign when this happens. And therefore, twice we have the number 11 representing God's judgment in the date as well as the ruling year of that king. However, with regards to the second temple, Roman legions under Titus retook and destroyed much of Jerusalem, including the second temple. And this all happened on August 30th of 70 AD, which is 11, because 8 plus 30 is 38, and 38 is 11. And therefore, in both examples are dates that revolve around the number 11. However, what makes this really interesting is the similarities within our next example, and that is the fall of the Christian Roman Empire. Because at one point, the Roman Empire was the beacon of the church. And so, if we compare both side by side, Israel started out as one united kingdom, as did the Roman Empire. However, both kingdoms would split, and both kingdoms would lose their counterpart, leaving the southern kingdom of Judah and the Byzantine Empire of the Romans, to which is where the temple or capital respectively was located. However, what makes the fall of these latter kingdoms, Judah and Constantinople, interesting is that the presiding ruler of either kingdom and the date that they were attacked on are both equal to 11, because King Zedekiah being in the 11th year and attacked on 10/10, whereas the ruler of the Byzantine Empire was Constantine 11th, and he was killed in battle on 5/29 of 1453. And this particular battle would end the Byzantine Empire as we know it. And so both events demonstrate the number 11 having a connection to the ruler as well as the fateful date that judgment would be executed on. However, let's switch tracks and talk about God's judgment in context with end-time events as an overall summary, because these events will ultimately lead to the fulfillment of God's promise of judgment, the crushing of the head of the seed of the serpent. Because one thing that we will discover are many Old Testament end-time prophecies are in chapters that equal 11, like Daniel 11 and Psalm 83 and Ezekiel 38. And not only do these all relate to the number 11, but all three are in reference to the exact same end time event, or at a minimum, they're at least tied to each other. And what's interesting about these particular numbers is that if we place the numbers like this with 11 in the middle, then 83 is the mere flip to 38, which we learned in the video that I previously did on God found in mathematics, because this symmetry about the number 11 is referenced there. And so I say that to say this, that when you add 38 plus 83, it equals 121, which is 11 squared, or 1111, which is the number of end time events, as we learned in the first video. because it is the second phase of God's first promise. And just as we saw an example in Isaiah 11:11, which could also be added to the list of end-time events and chapter numbers that equal 11, as well as Ezekiel 11, but you could also add Joel 2, because what is unique about this chapter is that verse 11 references the day of the Lord, which is God's final judgment, and further demonstrates a connection between 11:11 within the chapter and verse as being numbers of end-time events, which is interesting because the book of Revelation is all about end-time events as well, and is 22 chapters long, and 22 is 2 times 11, which is 11:11 again. And so as you can see, all these examples either reference events dealing with the number 11 or chapters and God's judgment. And since we know that the crushing of the head of the seed of the serpent is a judgment, then we know that this date and even the precursor dates leading up to it will be dates that add to 11 as well. And so this brings us to our final topic, the fulfillment of God's ultimate judgment. So with that said, let's explore some modern events that happened recently that is pointing to Jesus Christ's soon return and judgment. So let's begin. Before we begin, let's recap a few things. For instance, we learned from the first video that the first phase of God's promise, the blessing of the seed of the woman, will come to pass through the nation of Israel. Therefore, God's second phase of God's promise, the judgment of the crushing of the head of the serpent, would also come to the nation of Israel as well. Secondly, from the first video, Israel's regathering as a nation, signifying the start of God's second phase of his first promise, because the Jewish people will build a third temple, which is a necessary part for the prophecy of the abomination of desolation to come true when he stands in the third temple. Lastly, in both videos, we have demonstrated that the number 11 connects instrumental events to the fulfillment of God's promises, either being a blessing or a judgment, by unique dates that add to 11. And so moreover, we know that the nation of Israel will play a major role in end-time events that deal with the number 11. To demonstrate of Christ's soon return and judgment, let's begin a small timeline of events. And from our first video, we learned the first two events of this timeline. The UN resolution that gathered the Jews into Israel on 11/29, and secondly, the Six-Day War of 1967, which is when Israel recaptured the city of Jerusalem since the time of Jesus, and is significant because this is where the first and second temples were located. And so these two events are crucial to end-time prophecy being fulfilled. However, how do we know what comes next? Well, we know that the Antichrist will break a land covenant with Israel at some later point, according to Daniel chapter 9. And so our next unique event on the timeline deals with a land covenant. And based on the connection with dates and 11, I believe the newly formed peace treaty by the Trump administration that was proposed on 1/28 is significant because it adds to 11, just as the first two instances on our timeline, and suggesting that this will be the land covenant that the Antichrist will either break or will build upon to break at a later date. However, I'm not saying that Trump or Kushner, who spearheaded the plan, are the Antichrist, but that they play a major role within the fulfillment of this covenant by laying the groundwork of this new peace plan, which is a land resolution, just like the land covenant in end-time prophecy. And what makes this plan unique is that Jared Kushner would be the one to lead this endeavor, and there are 11 surrounding him. For example, he was born on 1/10 of 1981, which is 11. And it would be 38 years later, which is 11, when he would release the first portion of the two-part plan, which was released on 6/22, the 173rd day of the year, which is also 11. However, it would be 220 days later that he would release the second portion, which is 11 times 20, or 11/2, which is 11/11, lands on the date of 1/28, when Trump announced the plan. However, what is also interesting about Jared is his name, because in Hebrew it means shall come down, and is one of the names listed in the redemptive plan of Christ within the names of the genealogy from Adam to Noah, as you can see on the screen. What is interesting is that Jared, in this genealogy, was the father of Enoch, who would later be raptured by God. And so is it coincidental that Jared, who formed the peace plan and may be significant in revealing the Antichrist, is alluding to the rapture of the church? And what's interesting is that many scholars believe that Enoch will be one of the two witnesses that come back in the book of Revelation, chapter 11, interestingly enough. With that said, there are some unique relationships that connect 11 with Jared Kushner, and therefore the peace plan itself will play a major part in end-time prophecy. And so with that said, let's move on to the Antichrist and place the unveiling of this person on the timeline. Because although this hasn't happened yet, we do know a connection about him that relates to the number 11. Because according to Daniel, he will be the 11th horn that rises in end-time prophecy. And one of the things that he will do will be to confirm the land covenant, which I believe will be derived from the Trump peace treaty, since it follows the 11 date pattern. However, it will be this particular peace plan that the Antichrist confirms and will start the 7-year tribulation period, to which the Jewish people will rebuild a third temple, and subsequently the seed of the serpent will renege on the peace plan and attack Israel with the support of other end-time nations that come against them, and found in Ezekiel chapter 38. Therefore, the Trump peace treaty is signaling that the time for the revealing of the Antichrist is very close, because the pieces necessary for the peace plan are coming to fruition. And we also know that the rapture precedes the revealing of the Antichrist, and therefore making the event of the rapture even closer. And because the Antichrist is the seed of the serpent, that leads us to the final climatic moments in end-time prophecy. Because according to Ezekiel 38:16, the Antichrist comes against the Jewish people, and it will be in this moment when Christ fulfills his promise, and can be found in Hosea 5:15, which is 11. Because Jesus doesn't return until the Jews acknowledge him as the Messiah. Hence, why I believe that Hitler was a demonic attack against the Jewish people. Because without them, Christ doesn't return. And so, this is what chapter 6 says they will say, and is actually picking up from verse 15 of the previous chapter, when they say, "Come and let us return to the Lord. For he has torn us, but he will heal us. He has wounded us, but he will bandage us. After 2 days he will revive us. On the 3rd day he will raise us up. His appearing is prepared, and is as certain as the dawn. And he will come to us in salvation, like heavy rain, like spring rain watering the earth." And so doesn't that reflect the characteristics of Christ laid out in the Old Testament? And so it's this acknowledgement made by the Jewish people that will fulfill the second phase of God's first promise. And just as we saw in the timeline, the number 11 is playing and will play a major role in end-time events as they unfold, and highlighting God's soon judgment. Well, I hope this information was useful. Please note that this is my personal opinion, and I encourage you to do your own research and study the Bible, and see what conclusion you come to. With that said, don't forget to hit the like button if you enjoyed this video. Also, check us out on Facebook at SBDTV11, where we drop daily verses, quotes, our videos, and even other apologetics videos. I just want to thank you for watching. Have a blessed week, and we'll catch you on our next video.